my mentor and person I'm proud to be a friend of, Frank Gaffney and Cedric Stewart.
Thank you. Well, the truth of the matter is, she calls me a mentor. I remember when we first met, I was given direction as to what needed to be done. Right out here, as a matter of fact, as I recall. There was a school that Irene brought to my attention that was being established. I guess it's in the city, but not here, but the New York area. Basically to propagate Islam, Sharia, under the guise of an Arabic language academy. And I took direction on it from Irene. She put together a fabulous team. We've been working together ever since, so thank you for that very generous introduction. But just for the record, there's mentors and there's mentors, and she's one of mine, believe me. I'm really pleased to be here with two people, at least virtually, two other people with whom I'm privileged to work. They are people who are right in the thick of the fight, as I suspect are you, if not before tonight, hopefully after tonight. I want to also acknowledge my friend and colleague Tracy Johnson, who has helped Irene and others here put this together. Turns out everything goes better when Tracy's around, so this will be a seamless production, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ann and Brian Babin in a minute, but I thought maybe I'd just take a couple of moments to talk with you about the context in which their remarks should be considered. You know, the historian Arnold Toynbee famously said that civilizations die by suicide, not by murder. And there's a suicide watch underway at the moment in Europe. What's happening there, as I'm sure you're observing by what is endlessly sort of a closed loop broadcast, it seems, playing out on our news and other information outlets, is a serial and civilizational demise that is being brought about in part by what Europe has been doing to itself for some time. There's been the demographic problem, of course. They've got a below replacement population, which has been offset to some extent by importing people from elsewhere, notably from North Africa, to varying degrees from elsewhere. But this has sort of propped up the European birth rates artificially. But the people that are being born disproportionately are not of a European culture or civilization or value set. And that value set, by the way, has become mutated as well in Europe by the sort of, well, how do one call it, secularism. You know, increasingly, if you've been there recently, you'll know that churches are essentially museums now, not really houses of worship. Jews need not apply as residents any longer of Europe. They're really not welcome. On top of it, you have this preoccupation, even fetish really, with diversity, which is really just another way of saying somebody else's values and culture and civilization, ethnicity, geography, whatever you want to call it, is not just as important as those of the native population. It's really considered more important, better, preferred, because the native civilization has been associated with colonialism or wars or other bad things, holocausts. So you sort of put all this together and you have an environment that is ripe. I don't think it was really physician-assisted suicide, it's jihadist-assisted suicide that is now being enormously exacerbated by what, as you'll hear Ann talk about momentarily, is in the tradition going back to Muhammad's day, known as the Hijra. And that may or may not be a term you're familiar with, but it's a useful way of describing this because it is the religious obligation of the faithful Muslim to spread the faith to parts of the world in which it is not the dominant religion, and where it is the dominant religion, most others do not flourish, to say the least. But it is increasingly the case that you have these folks making the kind of pilgrimage, if you will, or migration, or invasion, colonization, that Muhammad experienced and practiced in his own life and has, in the many generations that have followed, imbued in his most faithful adherents. So you put, again, all of that together, and what we're watching play out before our very eyes is the death of Western civilization in Europe. And I'm sure you're hearing some of the horror stories, and let me just say, I'm sure that there are lots of Muslims, and for that matter, other migrants, because actually, technically, they don't qualify as refugees, but migrants to Europe who are not making trouble. Even though, by some estimates, something north of 70% of them are young, military-age men, unaccompanied men, of unknown background. There's no way to tell who they are, which is, of course, all the more worrying because among those who are saying they are using this refugee flow to insert operatives of outfits like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and for sure the Muslim Brotherhood. There are, however, whatever the majority may be doing at the moment, reports of mayhem being wrought by some of these folks. Looting, raping, murders, including, by the way, of Christians who have migrated from some of these hellholes with them in the camps in places like Germany. And then, not least, there's this natty little problem that we're now hearing reports that of the hundreds of thousands of these folks who have been welcomed into Germany, for example, the last number that I saw was 7,000, and I'm sure that's low at this point, but 7,000 of these folks had disappeared from the camps. Where they went, nobody seems to know. Did they simply move into areas of Europe that have now become known, though it's a matter of some controversy, I don't think it's actually disputable, but they become known as no-go zones. Places where you have basically ghettos of Muslim-only populations, in which the law of the land is not actually the law. Sharia is the law. And the authorities fear to enter, at least without considerable force. Or have they married up with cells that presumably have already been deployed? Maybe they're in those no-go zones, maybe they're elsewhere. We don't know. Maybe they've come here. It's a distinct possibility. But if they haven't, for reasons that Ann Corcoran will tell you about momentarily. And then following her remarks, we'll hear from Congressman Brian Babin about what he's trying to do about this. But you'll hear about how it is a certitude that jihadists will be coming here in the future through a formal legal program. I'm not talking about people coming across the border illegally, that's happening too, to be sure. I'm talking about your tax dollars at work importing these people with all of the same problems that I just described are now manifest in Europe. Notably, that there is no way to vet them. And that's not something you can take my word for. That's what the Director of National Intelligence has said. That's what the FBI Director has said. That's what even the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security has said. Albeit hastening to add, but we have to let them in anyway. We're going to talk about why we're letting them in anyway, the mechanism by which that's being done, the costs to us of doing it, and the lack of accountability for this whole process. I'm very pleased to say that you have really one of the country's foremost experts on these subjects joining us, as I say, virtually via Skype. Ann is a remarkable person. I imagine she'll tell you a little bit about her personal story, but just to steal her thunder for a moment. She is, I see you don't call them every man if they're of the female persuasion, but every woman. She is an American citizen like you, who, like you, I hope, found herself confronting an utterly inexplicable situation and deciding that it wasn't acceptable for it to be inexplicable, it wasn't acceptable for it to go on unchallenged, and she not only successfully challenged it, as she'll tell you, but she has learned an immense amount about this whole so-called refugee resettlement program. And she's been kind enough to do for us a short monograph on the subject, which is called Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America. I believe we have some copies available for sale if you'd like to get one. We also have a sign-in sheet, which, if I may, with the permission of our hosts, ask you to consider filling in if you'd like to get copies of not only this book, but other books in the series that this is one of the mainstays of. We call it the Civilization Jihad Reader Series. And that may be a term that's familiar to some of you, just very quickly. We learned as a result of an extraordinarily providential event in 2004. Some of you may have heard me say this or others, so I'll be quick about it, but the short form of it is this. On a spectacular piece of infrastructure down in my neck of the woods, Tracy's, there's a major artery called the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Anybody been across the Chesapeake? Well, oftentimes, perhaps in your own case, you get up to the apex of that bridge and you're looking out at this spectacular seascape. And you're inclined to whip out a camera and take a picture. Fortuitously, on this occasion, an alert Maryland Transportation Police officer happened to be keeping an eye on things on the and he noticed that a woman who happened to be wearing a hijab, I'm sure that didn't have anything to do with his taking a look at her, because that would be, of course, profiling. We don't do that. But in any event, he did happen to notice that she had taken out a camera all right, except instead of looking at the wonders of nature, she was looking at the structural supports of the bridge, which, being a trained police officer, he thought was not a good thing. So he pulled the couple over and ran the IDs on the two. It turned out the driver, her husband, was a fellow by the name of Ismail El Barassa, who was wanted at the time, this is 2004, on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago in connection with suspicion that he was involved in raising funds for a designated terrorist organization known as Hamas. That gave rise to a search warrant which the FBI executed on their home in another community near us, Annandale, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And the FBI went top to bottom, and lo and behold, below the bottom, found a secret subbasement in which were 80 banker boxes worth of documents that turned out on inspection and translation to be the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America.
Wow.
It's a pretty amazing thing. As far as I can tell, we've only actually had made available to the public one document out of all of those boxes. But it was an important one. It was introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2008 in Richardson, Texas. This was the largest terrorism financing trial in the nation's history. And this particular document was presented by the prosecution and used successfully to convict 5 other people who were raising funds for Hamas. As the strategic plan of the Muslim Brotherhood for what they called civilization jihad, by which they mean the kind of jihad you engage in when you're not strong enough to use the preferred kind, which involves separating people from their heads. This is a stealthy, seditious, and very dangerous kind of jihad in countries like ours, and for that matter, countries like those of Europe. So Civilization Jihad is what we call this reader series, and it's designed to help you understand what on earth is going on with these guys, pursuant to this secret plan, which they call the Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal of the Group in North America, kind of unwieldy, not likely to be a bestseller. In fact, it wasn't meant to be read by any of us, actually. It was meant as a report for the mothership back in Egypt. I commend this book to you. It's available as well, as are now 7 or 8 of these Civilization Jihad. We're cranking them out pretty quickly, so I've lost count. But please give us your name and coordinates, and we'll get one of them to you. And if you'd like to get more, you can do that. Also, by the way, frankly, if you want to get them for free right away, just go to our website, securefreedom.org, and look under books. Anyway, one of the mainstays of that collection is Ann Corcoran's book about the Hijra to America. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Ann Corcoran.
Hi everybody, how are you this evening? I can see you out there. Can you see me? Good, good. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Frank, so much for that kind introduction. Let me tell you a little bit how I got started on all of this. I live in Western Maryland, rural Western Maryland, in a red county. Just busy raising my kids. I live on a farm. I was hauling children to soccer games and so on and so forth. When it came to my attention and others in our community, that a church group from Virginia, they're called the Virginia Council of Churches, was quietly bringing refugees to our county without telling anybody about it. And some of my lady friends and I just wanted to know, okay, how can they do this? What is the governmental process that allows this to happen? And so one thing led to another, and I have been writing about this program now for the last 8 years. This happened in 2007. About 100 of the refugees they brought to our county, without asking anybody, were 100 Meskhetian Turks, which are Russian Turkish Muslims, Russia didn't want them, Turkey didn't want them, and we took literally, probably in total about 20,000 of them into the United States at about that time and distributed them around the country. So I've just been plugging away at this, and the reason I tell you that is that, tell you that little story about myself and how I got started, is that I want you to know that all of us can be finding ways like this to literally do a little bit every day really to save Western civilization. That's what this is about. So I want to tell you about the refugee program. I have this little PowerPoint. We're going to just slide through it so we have lots of time for questions. And as Frank said, can you believe this incredible situation going on in Europe now? And now we are discussing bringing the Syrian refugees to the United States. One of the things I want to mention though before I start is my big concern with the program is the number of refugees we're bringing and where we're bringing them from. This isn't a case of, in the old days, let me just say, some of you may have had some experience with this. When the Vietnamese refugees came, for example, they came and were taken care of by individual churches. Maybe some of your churches or synagogues or whatever took care of some Vietnamese families. And that was a whole different system than we have today. So, Tracy, go to the first slide, which would be the U.S. RAP program. Got that?
We're all there.
Okay, great. The program is secretive, complicated, expensive, and unfair, in my view. And one of the things, let me mention, Frank had mentioned earlier the issue of refugees and migrants in Europe. I need to clarify some terminology here because it keeps coming out. But let me just say, Al Jazeera would like us to call them all refugees, because refugees get all sorts of benefits, which we'll talk about in a minute. But frankly, many of them, those arriving in Europe are migrants, or they are economic migrants, meaning they're there for jobs. Go to the next slide. The refugee program is direct responsibility of Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden, who were the major sponsors of the bill back in 1980, and the bill was signed into law by Jimmy Carter. But let me just ask you, guess which state, and it's not Massachusetts, guess which state gets almost no refugees every year?
Delaware.
What did you say?
Delaware.
Delaware, you got it. Delaware. Hardly gets any, less than 10. Next slide. These two, this is Ann Richard on the left. She's the Assistant Secretary of State in Obama's State Department. And it's Ann Richard, and that on the right is Antonio Guterres, who I had the pleasure of hearing speak the other day in Washington. And what he was talking about, by the way, he is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He's picking most of our refugees. And his talk, which he gave in Washington last week, was all about climate refugees. There was not one single word in his talk until the question and answer period about Islam creating refugees around the world. It was all about climate refugees. So between the two of them, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees picks our refugees, and Richard, the Assistant Secretary of State, basically helps decide where they're going to go around the United States. So, next slide. How many of you, show of hands, have heard of Obama's task force on new Americans? I see a few back there. I can't see everybody. Let me see. Task force on new Americans. Oh yes, there's a few back there. Obama created a task force this year called his Task Force, obviously, on New Americans. They are literally changing America by changing the people, and they're just outright saying it. They want to make sure there is diversity in every town in America, every large and small town in America, and that they are actually using the word seeding when they're talking about these immigrants that they're bringing into the towns. And on the Obama's right there, that is Cecilia Munoz, who came from La Raza, and on his left, of course, is Valerie Jarrett. And they're working very hard right now. I'm going to tell you more about this idea of seeding America. Okay, so, next slide. Who calls the shots? We already just talked about the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. She uses most of our refugees. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security is supposed to screen them, but as you've been seeing in the news lately, they're having a very hard time doing that with the Syrians, which we're going to get to further and as we get along here further. The U.S. State Department distributes them to your towns through 9 major federal contractors. These are non-governmental organizations. We're going to talk about that in a minute. They have 350 subcontractors in 190 cities. This is a $1 billion program. It costs $1 billion just to get the refugees into the country. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement has millions of dollars more grants for these various contractors to resettle the refugees. So, next slide. These are the 9 contractors. I'll let you have a look at that while I just talk about them. And the number in parentheses afterward is the amount of federal dollars they're receiving to resettle refugees. So, you can see the top one there is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. It is 98%. These numbers are for 2012. I did this analysis for the numbers for 2012. 98% funded by the federal taxpayer to resettle refugees around the country. The International Rescue Committee is 73%, as you can see. There are 6 of them that are ostensibly religious organizations. The Bishops, World Relief, which is evangelicals, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Church World Service, which is a lot of mainstream Protestant churches, Episcopal Migration Ministries. We don't know how much money they get from the federal government because they don't file a Form 990 with the federal government. Then the last of the ostensibly religious ones is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is 61% funded by the federal government. They're the 9 major federal resettlement contractors, and they are bringing very, very large numbers of Muslims into the country now, all of them. They don't, I've never heard one of them say, let's save the Christians first. I've been to a lot of meetings where they've been in speaking. Next slide. This is just a map showing you the top states in the nation. There are 5 states that are the top refugee resettlement states in the country. Texas being number 1. You can see New York there is the 3rd. Go to the next slide, Tracy. This just shows the top dozen states in this year, and I did the numbers as of July 31st. And the refugees are coming, I should say, from Iraq. The top countries for refugee resettlement right now are Burma, and most of the Burmese are Christian, but there are now a very large number of Burmese Muslims coming in, with about 12,000 of them in the last 10 years, which I was surprised to see the number that high. Somalis are very high. We've brought over 120,000 Somalis to the United States in the last 20 years. You might know that many of those have been going to Minnesota. So that's just an idea of the top states there. Next slide. One of the numbers that doesn't show up in the previous slide, for example, are secondary migrants. This is a Somali family that was resettled in Connecticut, but moved within 4 months to Minnesota. And what's happening is that the Somalis are congregating in various parts of the country. You've probably heard a lot about the problems they're having in Minnesota with the young people going back to fight with Al-Shabaab or with ISIS, which we'll talk about further in a minute here. But secondary migrants are refugees resettled somewhere else, but they move to join an enclave of others of their people. So right now, Somalis are moving from different, they might be resettled in Connecticut, but they're immediately moving to Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Minneapolis, San Diego, and Seattle are big Somali Muslim states. Next slide. This is just, I know you can't see these little things on this map, but I just want you to know this is the 190 plus cities that they had targeted in 2014 throughout the United States. Now, I want to mention that Wyoming does not have refugees so far, although the Republican governor there has been pushing for it. Montana did have a little refugee program, but they haven't taken any in the last couple of years. So basically, the only 2 states in the nation not taking refugees now are Montana and Wyoming, not taking any. I'm not sure what everybody's laughing about.
We're all looking to move.
And here we go.
But anyway, so refugees are eligible for all social services the same as U.S. citizens. This is not so of other legal immigrant programs. Other legal immigrants who come into the United States must wait 5 years to access welfare. Not so for refugees. And this is why everybody wants to be called a refugee when they come here. And this is why Obama is trying to expand the definition of refugees, especially with the unaccompanied alien children, which you've probably been hearing a lot about that came across the southern border. Obama wants them to be called refugees. And that's because they can ultimately bring in their family members, but they're also eligible for all forms of welfare, the same as American citizens. And I should say the contractor, for example, the Catholic charities that get funded by the federal government, their job is to get the refugees their social services when they get here. They take the refugees, they hope they get them, signed up for all their different welfare, they get the kids enrolled in school, and they get them their subsidized housing. And then in 3 to 6 months, they're supposed to be on their own. Yeah, they're supposed to be self-sufficient in 3 to 6 months. We're going to skip, Tracy, I think 13 and 14 just to save time. And if we have time, we'll come back to that, and we'll go on to 15. This is David Lubell, and he has an organization called Welcoming America. It was originally funded by George Soros. The reason I have that little picture there is I first heard about Welcoming America at a Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania that I went to attend. And what David Lubell's organization was talking about there, they had been hired by the federal government, so now they get federal funding as well as private funding from the likes of Soros. What they were talking about at that meeting is that pockets of resistance were forming around the country, and they were calling any of us, people like me, who had questions about the program, as being resistors, and that what they had to do was push back on the pockets of resistance. And this little picture here with the little plant and the soil is literally the slide they had on the screen at this meeting I went to, and they talked about how the immigrants coming to America were being seeded, and that was the little seedling there that they had on the screen, and the immigrants were the seedlings, and we were the soil, and that the immigrants were not going to change. They literally said this, but that the soil had to change to accommodate the seedling, which I thought was just fascinating. And then David Lubell now in recent times, he's been on Air Force One with Obama. They're really pushing this idea of diversifying American towns and with seeding them, and that they also are, David Lubell and his organization are trying to get our minds right. They're literally going around the country wherever pockets of resistance are popping up and trying to push back on them. Next slide. So here are some pockets of resistance, but just today I wrote about Fargo, North Dakota. They're really resisting in Fargo, North Dakota. But we have Nashville, Tennessee, there's pushback. Springfield and Lynn, Massachusetts, which I especially love because, that being Ted Kennedy's home state. Those two mayors there are very unhappy with all the refugees. They can't manage it. Lewiston, Maine, you may have heard of with the large Somali population. Amarillo, Texas is pushing back. Atlanta, Georgia's suburbs are pushing back. Manchester, New Hampshire, the mayor there has tried to get the program slowed. And here's the problem. Once the program is up and running and refugees are coming to your city or your small town, there's almost no stopping it. And it's because the contractors then start to do applications for the family members. So in Manchester, New Hampshire, and it's not even the worst, the mayor told me in a phone conversation that he has 82 languages in his school system, and these school systems just can't handle that huge amount of work with children with those many languages. And many times the children come having had no formal schooling whatsoever. So it's a real huge impact first and foremost on school systems. There's a big pocket of resistance in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Some of you may know that was Michelle Bachmann's district. They just swamped it with Somalis, and they've got all kinds of problems going on there now. Twin Falls, Idaho, another very active pocket of resistance. And another is Spartanburg, South Carolina. As I said today, Fargo, North Dakota is really pushing back too on this. Next slide. I just wanted to show you this. One of the pockets of resistance in Minnesota, the folks there created this slide. A petition that they did, and so I thought you might get a kick out of the picture that they have with their petition. What they want to do, they were petitioning that no refugee resettlement should happen in a community without local input, which is really one of the big problems with the program, which I found here, is that it's really done secretly and there's no consultation with local communities. So next slide. What I'm going to show you here is a whole series. We'll try to go through these as quickly as I can. One of the things you hear all the time from the federal government is that they screen these refugees with great care. And I'm telling you, they can't. And here's a prime example. These are Iraqi refugees that were resettled in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is Rand Paul's hometown, by the way. And shortly after they were here working in a meatpacking plant, by the way, meat packers really want these refugees for cheap labor. And they lied, these two, surprise, lied on their refugee applications when they were asked had they ever been involved with any kind of terrorist group in Iraq. And they said no. I mean, did we really expect them to say yes? They were asked. Anyway, these two were working on a scheme to send guns or some sort of weapons, and you'll see in my next slide, to Iraq, and when they were caught. And one of the things that the investigators found that was such a huge surprise is that one of them, apparently, when our people are killed with IEDs in Iraq, the military archives or keeps in storage the parts, the shards from the IED, the pieces of it, and one of these two had fingerprints on a shard, an IED shard that was stored by our military that had killed Pennsylvania National Guard troop members. And so those members of that National Guard troop were very anxious to come to the trials for these two, but they did a plea deal and they've been put away for life. But here's the deal. These are two Iraqi refugees that we brought in to give a new life to, a good life to, and now we're going to pay for their prison term for the rest of their lives. This is just a picture of, this is from ABC News. Believe it or not, ABC News did a report on these two Iraqi refugee terrorists, and actually used the word refugee, which was very surprising. That was in 2013. Next slide. Now, one of the things you're going to hear about all the time is that all of those who helped our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm sure there were many good people that helped our troops, but this was a horrible case. Diana West wrote about it in 2014. This guy, Jason Mohammed Ramadan up here, the second from the right, my right, and this whole gang brutally raped a woman in Colorado. And as you can see there, the police said it was horrific and one of the worst in Colorado history. They were all Iraqis who helped us in Iraq and were brought here under that special immigrant visa program for Iraqis who helped us. But Ramadan himself was the most incredible case because he was brought in by an officer who helped him get in. I should not have brought in, but helped him get into the country. And the officer actually wrote a book about him and everything, glowing book about him. And he was on Oprah. This Ramadan was on Oprah before he did this brutal rape. So again, I don't know what the sentence the other guys got, but Ramadan got life. So, there's another one that we're going to now take care of in our prison system for life. Next slide. This is one of the Somalis who left Minneapolis to go join ISIS, and he died over there. Yeah, no problem there. But he died at age 29, and he left 9 children in America and 3 wives. So we will be taking care of his children and his wives forever. Next slide. Let's see, where are we? I think I lost track of where I am. Yes, okay. Now this is another horrible case. This is another Iraqi refugee. And he's weeping over in a mosque, he's weeping over his wife's feet. She was brutally beaten to death. And when she was brutally beaten to death, someone penned a note next to her body that said, "This is my country, go back to yours, terrorists." And so even CARE got involved. It was this big problem. It was in El Cajon, California. It was a big thing about the Islamophobes who killed his wife, blah, blah, blah. Well, he was found guilty of killing his wife, and here he is. But we're going to take care of him in prison for life. She wanted to leave the marriage because she wanted to be more Americanized. And he didn't want that. Next slide. This is a horrible case that should have made the national news and never did. It went on for several years in Utah. This refugee, Isar Met, came to the United States. He's a Rohingya Muslim from Burma, and that's a little Burmese Christian girl. He brutally raped and murdered her in the apartment complex in Salt Lake City, where he lived in, one apartment near her. He hadn't been here very long, a month or two. To their credit, the Salt Lake Tribune sent a reporter to the camps in Thailand to find out what the circumstance had been. They didn't know each other in the camps because he as a Muslim, was kept in a different part of the UN camp from her, who was a Christian. But our resettlement contractor in Salt Lake, and it was probably Catholic Charities, they never admitted it, but they're one of the major ones in Salt Lake City, put them in the same apartment complex, murdered this little girl, and it was a very sad case that drug on for years, actually, and literally destroyed her family. She was the darling daughter born at the end of their life, their older couple's lives, and they had all these older grown-up sons, and they had this one little daughter, and she was brutally murdered by him. But and one of the things the reporter discovered in Thailand was that Isar Met, was mentally disturbed. So the question is, why are we even bothering bringing, why are we did all this talk about screening? I mean, he clearly wasn't screened. Or why would we bring in a mentally disturbed person in the first place? Next slide, and this is a case just happened in Portland, Maine a few months ago. Somalis, the man on the right was a well-respected African immigrant who was a social worker, and he was found beaten to death by these Somalis in his apartment, and a bloody Bible was found near his body. For a week, the media was a media blackout because the judge didn't want the public to know about how badly he was beaten to death and about the bloody Bible and all that sort of stuff. So they can't screen these. They can't screen these refugees, no matter how they tell you they will. Next slide. Frank's already talked about Europe, so I don't have to talk too much about it. Colonel Gaddafi, you may be familiar with his prediction. On the left is a large group of migrants who just got off a ship in Europe. This has been going on for several years now. This isn't new, but Colonel Gaddafi predicted at the end of his life that Europe would be conquered not by guns and swords, but by masses of Muslim humanity, and that's exactly what's happening. And Frank mentioned this, which is the basis of my little book. Muhammad told his followers, "I charge you with 5 of what Allah has charged me with, to assemble, to listen, to obey, to immigrate, and to wage jihad for the sake of Allah." And migration is jihad, and that's what's going on in Europe right now, and it's going on here too. Now, I just want to jump ahead to the next slide. Obama did come out with his presidential determination in October. He's upped the number. He has been choosing around 70,000 refugees a year. In this fiscal year, which has already started, he has increased it to 85,000 refugees that will be coming into the United States, and 10,000 of them are expected to be Syrian Muslims. And I say that with almost certainty because I've done the research on the numbers who have come so far, and 97% of the refugees we've brought in from Syria, a small number, less than 2,000 so far, but 97% of them are Muslim Syrians. We are not saving the Christians. I want to emphasize that. If you think we're saving the Christians, we are not saving the Christians with this program. Obama says the following year he's going to up it to 100,000. shot. He does this, the president does the determination in September. He has one more shot past this year. He has next September, where he's going to be saying how many refugees will be brought in next year of 2017, so even after he's gone. Can I have the next slide? I think that Frank came up with this Jihad Caucus phrase. Frank, did you come up with that?
Yes.
He did. 14 senators led by Senator Dick Durbin have told Obama that 10,000 is not enough. They want 65,000 Syrians and before his term ends in 2016. And then the contractors, the resettlement contractors are asking for 100,000 Syrians. They've had press releases, they're pressing Obama for 100,000 Syrians before he leaves office, which is just unbelievable. Next slide. Oh, I already mentioned this, that 97% of the Syrians admitted to the U.S. in 2015 are Muslims. And those are the states where the few that I did as of, let's see, when was this? A few months ago, have gone to. You can see the top states for getting Syrians. Actually, you know, what is that? New York isn't on there. I'm lucky you. But New Jersey. New Jersey wants them big time. Okay. Now, this is an older slide. The FBI testified in Homeland Security hearing that they can't screen the Syrians. But since Michael Steinbach, who was the assistant director, testified to that, the director, Comey himself, has testified just in the last few weeks that they can't screen the Syrian refugees for security reasons. And that's because there's virtually no data on them. They're coming from a failed state. Next slide. You're going to hear, I think, shortly about Rep. Brian Babin, who is the first person in my 8 years of doing this to even lift one single finger to do anything to bring this program under control. And he's introduced this bill, which seeks to halt the program until we have a financial and a security accounting for the program. And it's a very brave thing. I haven't looked at how many co-sponsors he has, but I think it's above 30 now, which is just unbelievable to me, having watched this over these years, that to anybody even do any such thing. I got to hear him speak recently in Washington. Now, Rep. Trey Gowdy, you should know, you probably saw the pockets of resistance I showed you earlier, and one of them was Spartanburg, South Carolina. They're going to get refugees this year. Gowdy is chairman of the House Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security, and I have to tell you, I'm very disappointed in him. He could be holding hearings on this program, and he has not. He sent a couple of tough letters to the Secretary of State complaining about the program in Spartanburg, South Carolina, but he's not said a word about the program publicly. Otherwise, as chairman of that subcommittee, he's responsible for the program, and he could be holding hearings. Hopefully he will come around. And I should mention on public hearings that we did have a very good public hearing with Senator Jeff Sessions on this program a few weeks back. He was fabulous. He brought some of the government officials in and just really raked them over the coals, and that was wonderful to see. Two things I just want to mention before wrapping up. This is Jim Simpson's little book. You heard Frank talk about the book series, the Civilizational Jihad series, and this is one of them. Jim Simpson, he wrote this book after my little book, and it is fabulous. I would encourage you to read it because he goes a lot deeper than I did in terms of the finances and so on and so forth of this of the Refugee Resettlement Program. So, and then the next slide is my little book. And I just want to say, because I want to leave lots of time for questions here, again, I would urge you to find your little piece of wherever your talents lie, find your little piece that you could work on every day, just a little bit. We really are working to save Western civilization, and I couldn't say that more strongly. This is the most serious threat in my mind to America, short of an EMP attack, which frankly will tell you is probably worse. and that this country is ever going to face since its founding. If we don't get this migration piece under control, none of the rest of it matters, because so much other stuff we're concerned about can be changed. Obamacare, Common Core, all the other things that conservative people are concerned about, but this can't be changed once the population is changed. So anyway, questions?
Yes. Stop it. And if your friend.
And what I think I'd like to do, if we may, is show Brian Babin's video.
Okay, great.
And then open it up to questions based on, in part, what he's going to talk about as well, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Let me just introduce, first of all, a round of applause for Ann Corcoran. So did you recognize her? Every woman, an American patriot who just heard the sound of the guns and marched towards them. She's really a national treasure. I'm thrilled to tell you, though you may know this already, one of the things that we're trying to do with these little monographs is make them as accessible to people as we can, both by, the content, which talks about the problems that they're addressing in this area. She mentioned Jim Simpson's book about how the left and the Islamists are partnering up to erase America, as he puts it. We've got a book about how they're into our court system and why we believe we need laws that express the principle that American laws will be used in American courts, not foreign laws. We have a terrific book by Debbie Weiss about the most important multinational organization you probably have never heard of. And it's not the United Nations, of course, it runs the United Nations. It's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And with the petrodollar wealth that we've transferred to many of its members, it's really quite a formidable force. 56 nations, they rounded up to include Palestine, 57 nations. You may remember Barack Obama back in the first campaign said he'd been to all 57 states. I'm just saying. He's probably happy, actually, about something that we've just put out recently. We call it Star Spangled Sharia, which is kind of a way of capturing the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood creating a political party in America to try to do what they've been doing in Europe, which is sort of be kingmakers on political outcomes. Rather than run candidates themselves, they just get a voting bloc and see, particularly in parliamentary systems, if they can't be the decisive force. So anyway, there are those and several more. Check them out, sign up if you'd like. I'm just going to say a brief word about Brian Babin. He's a freshman member of the United States House of Representatives from the 36th District of Texas, which is down in the southeastern part of the state. He's a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and also the Science and Technology Committee. He chairs, in fact, its Space Subcommittee, which is a big deal because he represents the Johnson Space Center down in the Houston area. He's a dentist, a former airborne artilleryman. He then got his dental degree and went back and served in the Air Force as a dentist. Just a remarkably decent, and again, sort of quality American patriot who heard about this problem, I think from us. I don't know, he may say something about it in this brief video. We were hoping to do a live feed and just couldn't work out the logistics of it, so this is kind of the next best thing. But he's currently introducing, somebody asked at the end of Ann's presentation, what can we do about this? He's trying with an important piece of legislation, which I would commend to you. It's H.R. 3314, the title of which is the Resettlement Accountability National Security Act. And he'll, I'm sure, talk about what it involves. We'll do Q&A about it as well. But it's one way of helping to exercise some control on what is otherwise now really a runaway and very, very dangerous train. So, Tracy, if you can kick in to hear Congressman Babin's remarks, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Babin, dentist, and Congressman from District 36 in Texas. And I'd like to say thank you to all of you folks out there. Hello to Center for Security Policy. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit tonight about my bill, the Resettlement Accountability and National Security Act of 2015. Very, very important, significant issue that has quite a bit to do with our national defense. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but just as a little history, we are importing 70,000 refugees a year under the Resettlement Act of 1980. These 70,000 per year are being chosen by the United Nations, but come into the United States at taxpayer expense, I should note, and also are being resettled around the country by private federal contractors. Now that we have the disaster in the Middle East, which has displaced well over 1 million persons who are streaming out of the Syrian conflict in western Iraq, fleeing the problems and the war that's going on between the 5 powers there, Bashar Assad, and ISIS and several other groups. They're clamoring to get into Western Europe and over into the United States of America. And so now President Obama has agreed, his administration has agreed to take in an additional 10,000 refugees a year this year, and up that to an additional 30,000 by the year 2017, which would put us at 100,000 UN refugees coming into the United States per year. I don't think we need to look any farther than Western Europe to see exactly what's in store for us here in the United States of America. ISIS has already pledged to infiltrate this refugee program, and indeed you don't have to look further than Western Europe and the problems they've had. They produced 4,000 ISIS fighters in Western Europe. We've, here in the United States, have produced 250. Look at the Boston Marathon bombing. Look at Chattanooga, Tennessee, with 5 military recruiters murdered. Garland, Texas, Oklahoma City. We have jihadis here today, ladies and gentlemen. And what we're going to do by bringing in these people from the Middle East and this war-torn area is import ISIS. And ISIS will have an open door of opportunity to establish bases of opportunity in the United States, not only legally, but at taxpayer expense. And I think it's just lunacy to try to do this. And even President Obama's own directors of the FBI, the NSA, and also the Department of Homeland Security, all 3 of these directors and secretaries have said that we cannot properly vet and screen these refugees that are wanting to come in. And so for that reason, my bill, the Resettlement Accountability and National Security Act of 2015, will do 2 things. Number one, we know 95% of them are coming, these refugees come in already on, well, a federal welfare program. So we want to do a GAO study of just what this is costing fiscally the American taxpayer. And more importantly than that, number 2, we need to do a national security evaluation and risk assessment of just what this is going to do to our national security. And although I have been called a few politically incorrect names for coming up with this bill, that doesn't bother me because we need to remember our oaths of office here as congressmen and members of Congress in the United States legislative branch, and remember that we need to have this health and safety and the security of U.S. citizens above all else, and our national security. And so let them call me in politically incorrect names if they want to. I would ask you folks out there to contact your senators, contact your members of the U.S. House, and tell them to get on H.R. 3314, the Resettlement, Accountability, and National Security Act, and be a co-sponsor. Tell them to have courage. Get on this, because it is craziness to allow these people to come into the United States and endanger our children and our grandchildren and the national security of this great nation. Thank you.
Well, you can see by the redundancy between some of the things that he said and some of the things that I said that we had not coordinated this at all. But I just want to thank both Ann and Brian Babin for participating in this program, especially what he kind of alluded to there, which is the response that he's getting from many of his colleagues. We talked about this privately a couple of days ago. It's not just, you know, the names that he's being called, not necessarily by his own colleagues, but certainly by others, but it's the palpable fear that many of these members of the House are exhibiting when he asked them to co-sponsor this legislation. So one of the things that I would like to just maybe throw out as a way of leading into the Q&A with Ann is we need pockets of resistance that can translate into support networks for members of Congress who do want to do the right thing. Are there any pockets of resistance, or are there any members of Congress? There are. Let me just say a word on this, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ann. One of the things that I lived through personally, because I kind of helped get her into this jam. Ann Corcoran mentioned Michelle Bachmann, whom I'm sure everybody in this room appreciates. Back in the summer of 2012, on the basis in part of some information that we had developed and produced in a video, we called it a course, entitled Muslim Brotherhood in America, which you can look at if you have 8 hours of time at your leisure, online for free. It's called the MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com is the website. We found evidence that there were people inside each of 5 agencies of the United States government. The Defense Department, the Department of Homeland Security, the Justice Department, the State Department, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who had very clear sympathies with, if not actually ties to, the Muslim Brotherhood. And we were able, as well, to chronicle the extent to which in each of those 5 agencies there had been steps taken, policies promulgated or adopted or implemented that aligned with the desires and dictates of the Muslim Brotherhood. So what Michelle did with 4 of her colleagues, Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas, Congressman Trent Franks of Arizona, Congressman Lynn Westmoreland of Georgia, and Congressman Tom Rooney of Florida. They asked 5 inspectors general of these agencies, would you look at the possibility that the fact you've got Muslim brothers in influential positions may be contributing to the fact that your agencies are adopting policies desired by the Muslim Brotherhood? What a concept. And they did it very respectfully. I mean, there was no name calling. It was just the facts, man. But they threw these things into the Post, and nothing happened for about a month. Then, just about a month after they sent them off, John McCain went to the floor of the United States Senate and personally destroyed the career of Michelle Bachmann. Remember this? He went down and he basically accused her of sullying the reputation of a patriotic woman who was working for the Secretary of State, with whom he had traveled, whom he had known when they worked together in the Senate. You probably know her best as Mrs. Anthony Weiner out here, right? Also known as Homa Abedi. And I don't think he troubled to look at these letters. I think he just went after Michelle Bachmann and decided he would try to take her down. And he almost did. She won her re-election by 5,000 votes that year, having lost, I think it was 12 percentage points as a direct result of his attack and that of John Boehner and, sorry to say, Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio. And they, I think between that and the fact that, as Ann says, the State Department has been moving Somalis into that district, creating, as they seem to be trying to do in Louis Gohmert's district, as they seem to be trying to do in Trey Gowdy's district, and I think others as well, a different, more diverse, shall we say, population than had been the case when those Republican conservatives were elected there. So, I only mention this point, forgive me, Ann, for going on at length on this, but it's important for you to understand, when you ask the question, are there any legislators who are prepared to stand up with a guy like Brian Babin, to realize there isn't anybody, certainly anybody who served in Congress with Michelle Bachmann, and probably those who've come in long, since she left, who isn't thinking, if I do this, am I going to be destroyed too?
Yeah.
Will I be branded a racist and a bigot and an Islamophobe and basically run out of town on a rail? So, again, back to this point about pockets of resistance. If you think you need to be represented by people who are bringing common sense to bear, as Brian and Ann are on this kind of problem, we need to give them the kind of political cover and clear support that gives them the confidence that it's not a suicide mission for them to be standing with us. And, excuse me, and did you want to add anything to that general point?
No, that's good, that's very good.
Okay. Questions for Ann or me or anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Two quick but very important questions. One, why is there such silence on the persecution of the Christians in this country? And two, equally important, which presidential candidates would be on our side on this issue?
Oh, Frank, you gonna answer this?
Well, a point of clarification, I think you meant to say, why is there such silence in this country about the persecution of Christians elsewhere, not the persecution of the Christians here? But that's coming. You see it in the military right now, and it's starting to leach into other places too, but I knew what you meant. Look, it's sort of the same thing. The main point I really want to impress upon you about this civilization jihad business is, its first focus is silencing us. I mean, this is a little known fact, but it's important to understand. In March of 2009, not even 2 full months after Barack Obama came to office, the United States government co-sponsored with the Egyptian government, on behalf of that group I mentioned to you a moment ago, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a resolution in something called the UN Human Rights Council. The substantive effect of which, as Debbie Weiss points out in this little book, was to direct all of the members of the United Nations to effectively prohibit and punish those who give offense to Islam. Sharia blasphemy laws, effectively. Our government, with its constitutional duty to protect our freedom of speech, was embracing the OIC Muslim Brotherhood, Sharia adherent, Islamic supremacist agenda of silencing us. In accordance with which, by the way, of course, everything that Ann and I have said tonight would have been offensive to Muslims and, according to Sharia, a capital offense. Now, speaking of presidential candidates, one of them happened to have been serving in the Obama administration at the time. And apparently at some point concluded that a frontal assault on the First Amendment of the Constitution might not be a good idea. So instead, Hillary Clinton engaged in what she called the Istanbul process. The Istanbul process being a tripartite conversation between the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the EU, the European Union, and us. And its purpose was basically to try to figure out how to socialize in a system like ours, with a constitution like ours, this idea of not saying anything offensive, not writing anything offensive, and heavens forfend, not making a video that would be offensive to Muslims, say in Benghazi, Libya, for example. And one of the things, you may remember this, if you don't, look it up. One of the things that Hillary Clinton actually said as part of this Istanbul process was that, I mean, sort of in deference to this natty little problem of the First Amendment, we were going to use what she called, quote, old-fashioned techniques of shaming and peer pressure, unquote, basically to ensure that nobody would offend Muslims. So that's what's going on here, folks, and why that's so important is it's kind of foundational. If you can get everybody stupid about who you are, how you operate, what you're trying to do, because they can't talk about it, they can't share information, they can't learn about it. And by the way, that includes most especially the people who are supposed to protect us. Law enforcement, the military, the intelligence community, the Department of Homeland Security. They're not supposed to know about this stuff as a matter of government policy. Sharia blasphemy. So, if you don't know what's going on, you are much less likely to see how these civilization jihadist operations are rotting out our institutions and influencing policy and putting us all at greater and greater risk. I'm going to dodge the question of whether there are good people in the Republican ranks, because there are. You know there are. Some are going to be better than others. All of them will be better if you are an effective pocket of resistance and are demanding of our leaders, at the very least, that they demonstrate that they have a clue about what's going on here and offer an alternative to the American people. Okay. I can't get this any further out here. Who's got my?
Hey, Frank.
Oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Can I say something to in response to the first question about the Christians? I can't speak to why we're not focusing on the persecuted Christians, but I can say why we're not taking Christians into the United States, and Syrian Christians, and that is because the United Nations is picking our refugees. They are picking them from their camps in Jordan, and they're exclusively Muslim camps. The Christians do not go to the camps because it is too dangerous for them. And the other day, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees told us in a meeting, and probably, that in fact, the Christians aren't persecuted because Assad is protecting the Christians, which is somewhat true. Assad has protected the Christians, but in fact, that's why we don't take them, because they are protected, which is just crazy to think that they're being protected.
I forgot about that point. Let me just add one other thing quickly. And I think in part why they're not being better defended not just by our government, but even by the Christian community, is because the Christian community, and for that matter all of the faith communities, have been targeted by these civilization jihadists too. In fact, we have another book by a colleague by the name of Stephen Coughlin, who's one of the great students and teachers, really, of this whole Sharia business. And he's documented the extent to which the Catholic Church has been completely suborned by this whole idea of interfaith dialogue. Have you heard about this? Bridge building? Your synagogues, maybe, your churches have been vehicles for this. Let me just tell you, there's a fascinating insight into what's going on here. One of the most important texts in this sort of modern jihadist enterprise, we call it the global jihad movement, is a character by the name, it was written by a character by the name of Sayyid Qutb, K-U-T-B. It's called Milestones. And it's not uncommon when a jihadi gets killed to find a copy of Milestones, coming off with his head. What you see in Milestones, and this is a paraphrase, not an explicit quote, but it's something along these lines, very close. It says, the chasm between the unbeliever and the Muslim is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it, except for the purpose of bringing the unbeliever to Islam. In other words, it's a one-way street. They call it dawah. It's about proselytization and recruitment, indoctrination. My sister has a very good idea, and I commend it to you, any of you, if you'd like to see about executing it. Tracy Johnson is our principal duty officer on this on our staff. Some of you are almost as old as I am. Do you remember driving around your community back in the 70s and seeing outside basically every synagogue and usually a number of churches as well, banners saying, "Save Soviet Jewry"? Remember that? Well, it was a powerful way of both associating those congregations with an important human rights message, and also bringing it to a lot of people who weren't going to be inside that synagogue or that church. Well, my sister Devin, very creative, thought, we ought to do that for the persecuted church. Ideally with synagogues and churches doing it as well. But they will have to come up against what has been happening with this interfaith dialogue subversion, and the sooner, frankly, the better.
Hi, I'm Ken Greenberg, and we've met before, and thank you for events, and thank you for everything you do. Marie and I started our chapter back for Americans here.
Thank you.
My question, it's a tough one to answer. It's a big why. What I don't get, unless you tell me, well, it's Middle Eastern money flooding into Congress. We elect these people. I know they don't really represent us. I gave up on that concept, but why would they be doing this? What's in it for anybody? Just money? Is that to get reelected? Is that what it all is about? It doesn't even make sense. We should even need ALAC. The Constitution says we are the supreme moral law. We got to pass this other stuff. It makes no sense to me. So if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Let's, Ann, would you like to speculate on that?
Well, I think it's money. I think money's a big part of it. I can only speak for the refugee part of it and why we're bringing so many refugees in. It's being driven, it's not humanitarianism, that's just a cover for it. It's being driven by cheap labor. It's been frankly, it's being driven by Democrats who expect the refugees to vote for Democrats, which they probably will. It's sweeping the welfare state and all those things. But I think money's the big driver, frankly.
Well, let me
No, New World Order.
add a little bit more texture to it. Look, if you're talking about a group of 535 people in the Congress, which is I think what your focus was, There are lots of different factors at work here. To be honest with you, the one that troubles me most, bar none, is that I think most of them are just not paying attention.
I think so too. I think that's.
I have a thesis, and that is that we have more or less, as a nation, with notable blips like, 9/11, stopped thinking about national security since the end of the Cold War. Not all of us, and I think you wouldn't be here tonight if you weren't thinking about it, but unfortunately too many of us. We have national elections in which these issues scarcely feature. As often as not of late, Republicans have seemingly been trying to get to the left of Barack Obama, or at least he's been successfully getting to the right of them, rather than offering what my old boss Ronald Reagan did, which was a very stark contrast, which he described as peace through strength. But you've got to understand how important that is for it to matter to you, and for it, therefore, to be something that you're going to hold your members of Congress accountable for doing. So yeah, there are some that are bought. There are some that are, I think, moved by cheap labor or those in their constituencies who want them. These packing facilities, by the way, as Ann mentioned, are a real problem. They're a magnet for these refugee operations, which, by the way, if you think about it, is really a frightening prospect, given that they're in the food supply. Oh, don't touch the meat, all right. But the main thing is, I just want to leave with you this thought. Everything that we've talked about tonight, grim as it is, can be fixed, provided we start acting on this right away, rather than continue down the road that Europe has now plummeted into. They're further along, to be sure, but it's the same trajectory that these supremacists have in mind for us as well. If every single one of you in this room will just do one thing, you'll talk about what you learned tonight to somebody else. Just one other person. It will make a difference, let alone if you'll think about your larger circles of influence, let alone if you'll get involved in things like the ACT chapter or this wonderful organization or any other, ours included, to become even more effective, more knowledgeable, more plugged in, to join forces with other pockets of resistance. I think, Ann, you may have mentioned this, that our friend Jim Simpson has now helped foster something like 136 of them around the country, just to work on this refugee resettlement problem as a sort of microcosm. But I just want to share with you that last thought. This is still our country. Unless we choose, as the Europeans have done, to give up our national identity in the name of sensitivity, diversity, multiculturalism, political correctness, whatever you choose to call it, and commit national suicide with the rest of the Western civilization. I don't think you want to do it. I know we don't, and I want to thank you very much for being here.
Is the mic on? First of all, I do want to thank you as everyone here. On behalf of everyone who's come here out of such incredibly deep concern for what's happening, we want to thank you. I want to thank Ann. And your emails are the highlight and the low light of my day. So the question is, we all would like to know, in a practical sense, if we can't get Mr. Simpson to come to our town, what do we do? We have our groups. We have our Tea Party group. We have other groups in the area. Where do we go? How do we form a POR? Pocket of resistance.
The first thing, well, first get in touch with Jim, and Frank will tell you how to do that, and get into the network. They have conference calls all the time, probably once a week. He communicates almost every day with the people forming pockets of resistance. But you need to also just start to research and understand how the program works. I mean, you could follow my blog every day. I try to educate people every day. And just start reading things, start understanding how the program works, because that's the best and most effective way you're going to be able to fight it. I can assure you, wherever you live, that you're going to have refugees, because when I said there were 190 towns where there are, those are just the towns where there are refugee offices. They can resettle refugees within 100 miles of any of those offices, which pretty much covers everywhere. So you are going to get refugees. And you need to, so one of the things, let me just say too, one of the things that people are doing very successfully, they've done it in South Carolina just this week, is that people are studying the program and then are going to their elected local government ahead of time before refugees even come, and they're having a session with their elected government, 10 or 15 minutes before they'll, to speak to the group and say, that they don't want refugees as a preemptive thing. In other words, rather than wait till they show up, they're actually organizing preemptively, and they're actually doing it around the country, not just South Carolina, to just educate their local elected officials that this is a problem.
Well, let me just add to that. Jim Simpson will come, if you would like him to, or he will help you with, questions and helping organize or otherwise sharing information and experiences. One of the main things that we've got to avoid in this kind of fight is duplication of effort. And most especially duplicating mistakes that people have made when you can learn from them and avoid them. I don't know that this is the best email address for him, and he may be horrified that I'm going to give this to you, but I am anyway. It's wonders, WONDERS, number 2, at Verizon.net. Wonders2 at Verizon.net. But Ann, I want to say, and one of the reasons why it's such a joy to work with her is she is a paragon of what we're talking about here. She really is. And like you, I'm married to a woman who came here legally as an immigrant, let the record show, from Peru, and I've had her translating some of these books for us, starting with the explanatory memorandum into Spanish. She's now working her way very slowly through Ann's book about the Hijra, and she's on her mailing list as well. And Ann, did you give your mailing list, or best how to get plugged into your resource?
All you need to do is to Google Refugee Resettlement Watch, and it will pop right up. That's my blog. I write almost every day, sometimes too many times a day, on the program. I've written about 7,000 posts over the last 8 years on this subject, and I have been writing about Europe too, if that interests you, because I think Europe is a sign of what could happen here if we don't get on this right away.
Right. So my wife now tells me, much as you have, about the lowlights of her day coming across the wire from Ann. But again, thank you very much for letting us join you. These are great resources. We would love to help you and your efforts here, as well as those that we're trying to encourage in the way of pockets of resistance elsewhere. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.